Good evening. My name is Lenore Naxon, and I'm the director of the Friends Center for the Arts here at the Jewish Community Center of San Francisco. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program, Rebbe, with Rabbi Joseph Telushkin. That's fine, go ahead. This week, we launched the Arts and Ideas 2014-15 season here at the Jewish Community Center of San Francisco. Anyone here for the first time? I bet you there's some first-timers. Oh, welcome. We're so glad you're here. We love seeing new faces. We love seeing old faces. We love seeing everybody. We'd also love for you to consider becoming members of our Arts and Ideas patron circle. Membership gets you access to the best seats first, especially to the shows that are hardest to get tickets to, and many things sell out before they go on sale to the public. So your support also is really critical in helping us bring speakers like Rabbi Telushkin to the Bay Area. Our partners are also a big part of our program, as are our community partners, like tonight's NorCal Chabad. We wouldn't have made tonight's show happen without your support, so please join me in a round of applause to say thank you to Chabad. And I'd like to give a personal thanks to my wonderful colleague, Stephanie Singer, who produced this evening's program and did all the coordination and is not able to be here tonight for a good and wonderful reason. She's in New York at a simcha at her niece's bat mitzvah. So mazel tov to you, Stephanie. Yesterday was the 18th of the month of Elul in the Jewish calendar, or as it's sometimes referred to as Chai Elul. Chai Elul marks the birthday of two great luminaries, the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, and the Alter Rebbe, founder of the trend within Chasidim known as Chabad. The month of Elul is always a very special time of years for Jews. And here at the JCC, just as we did several moments before curtain, every morning at 10 a.m. sharp, a group of staff and children and members and the public gather to blow the shofar. Whether you're at your desk, in a meeting, getting a bagel from the cafe, on your way to work out, it's impossible to escape the distinct sounds of that chorus of horns, reminding us that we are nearing the high holidays. It's a time of reflection, repentance, and gratitude. So, I can't think of a more auspicious time of year, Elul, and within the month of Elul, Chai Elul, for us to reflect on the teachings and life of one of the most influential rabbis in modern history, Chabad Lubavitcher's Rebbe, Menachem Mendel Schneerson. Here this evening to tell us about the Rebbe is Rabbi Joseph Telushkin, named by Talk magazine as one of the 50 best speakers in the entire United States. He is the author of many best-selling books, including Jewish Literacy, the most widely selling book on Judaism in the last 2 decades, A Code of Jewish Ethics, Biblical Literacy, the Book of Jewish Values, the 10 Commandments of Character, and with Dennis Prager, one of the most influential Jewish books published in the last 30 years, The 9 Questions People Ask About Judaism, hailed by Herman Wouk as, quote, the intelligent skeptic's guide to Judaism, unquote. Rabbi Telushkin was ordained at Yeshiva University in New York. He lectures throughout the United States. He serves as senior associate of Kalal. He's on the board of directors at the Jewish Book Council and as spiritual leader of the Synagogue for the Performing Arts in Los Angeles. Rabbi will speak to us and then has graciously agreed to answer your questions. We ask that anyone wanting to ask a question come to the microphones that'll be at the bottom of the stairs, and please ask a question, don't tell a speech. Okay, that's his job, not yours tonight. Okay, good, okay. As long as we're all in agreement. Okay, following the presentation, please join us in the Patrick family atrium for book signing and some nosh from the Grand Bakery. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving him a warm welcome back to the Jewish Community Center of San Francisco. Rabbi Telushkin.
I love coming back to San Francisco, and I love coming back here. I'm speaking about the Rebbe, and I want to focus on a number of things, but most significantly, as you'll come to realize, I really want to focus on what are teachings of the Rebbe that are going to be relevant to people in their own individual lives. What I set out to do in the book is really to tell the story of this extraordinarily dynamic movement which has affected the whole Jewish world and gone beyond it. Yet when Menachem Mendel Schneerson became the 7th Lubavitcher Rebbe in 1951, Chabad was quite small. It was a movement headquartered in one neighborhood in Brooklyn called Crown Heights. And yet he does something, as far as I can tell, fairly unprecedented in Jewish life, in all of Jewish history. He sets out to reach every Jewish community in the world. I believe this was in part a response to the Holocaust. Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi of England, once made the point. He said, if the Nazis hunted down every Jew in hate, the Rebbe wanted to hunt down every Jew in love. And Chabad's been quite remarkable in doing so. I'll give you a few examples of what I mean. There are now Chabad houses in 49 of the 50 American states, which immediately makes everybody think, which state doesn't? Now, if you know the answer, don't answer, but I'm open to getting some guesses. Anybody want to guess? Which? Alaska? No, Alaska is quite active. And in fact, I'm speaking, God willing, between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. I'm speaking out in Alaska, in Anchorage. Any other guesses? Utah. People often guess Utah because it's such a Mormon state. There is a Chabad in Utah. I've spoken to the Chabad rabbi there, who's actually on quite good terms with the Mormon church there. Wyoming has one? Somebody got it right. South Dakota. South Dakota. As of a few months ago, there were Chabad houses in 48 states, and then the 49th was Mississippi. And now it's only South Dakota. I'm sure they're looking for naming opportunities. Somebody wants to establish the Chabad in South Dakota. But it's all over the world. There are now Chabad houses in 80 countries. My dear friend Dennis Prager spent Shabbat at the Chabad house in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, with 14 other people from 10 countries. And here's another question. Again, if you know the answer, don't give it. But where is the, otherwise try and guess, where is the largest Seder held each year? Kathmandu. 11, that great center of Jewish life. 1,100 people were at the Seder, mainly Israeli backpackers. So we're dealing with a phenomenon of extraordinary outreach. And it's gone just beyond, it's gone into the whole Jewish world and across Jewish denominational life. Rabbi Eric Yaffe, the longtime head of the Union of Reform Judaism, declared at a convention of the URJ, "It is hard for me to say it, but I will say this nonetheless. We must follow the example of Chabad." It is hard to imagine that any Reform rabbi would ever have said that before, not only about Chabad, but about any Orthodox rabbinic leader. Menachem Mendel Schneerson did something very unusual. He broke a mold. By the way, there was outreach to the non-Jewish world as well. Not outreach seeking conversion to Judaism, but seeking also a religious message, because Judaism had long held the notion of the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, the 7 laws, the 7 basic norms of any moral society. Throughout most of history, Jews were not apt to try and teach it to the non-Jewish world because we were too busy trying to maintain our own survival. The Rebbe sensed that in the United States, there really was a greater openness to Jews than elsewhere. But I'll tell you a fascinating story that I write of in my book. Shirley Chisholm was the first black woman ever elected to the House of Representatives. Chisholm was elected in 1968. She represented a neighborhood in Brooklyn called Bedford-Stuyvesant, and also part of Crown Heights. So Chabad and the Rebbe were actually her constituents. She arrives in Congress in 68. This is only 4 years after the passage of the landmark 1964 Civil Rights Bill. And the House is largely still controlled by old-time Southern Democrats. many of whom were still racists in those days. And so what they do to Shirley Chisholm is they take this representative from Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn and put her on the Agriculture Committee, leading one New York newspaper to headline the appointment, "A Tree Grows in Brooklyn." Shirley Chisholm didn't go to Congress to be on the Agriculture Committee, and she was very vocal and unhappy about the appointment. She gets a call from Rabbi Chodakov, the Rebbe's top aide, that Menachem Mendel Schneerson, one of her constituents, would like to meet with her. She well knew who the Rebbe was because she had met with him during the political campaign, and she comes in and she expresses her indignation at what had been done to her. She went to Congress, she wanted to work on issues of labor, she wanted to work on issues of education, and the Rebbe said to her, "So you're on the Agriculture Committee. Look at the opportunity God has given you. You represent a district that has many poor people. The Agriculture Committee is dealing with a lot of food surplus in the United States." And he urges her to expand the work of the food stamps, but she also then establishes WICs, Women, Infant, and Children, to help feed women who are vulnerable. In 1983, when she retires from Congress, she has a retirement breakfast, and at that breakfast she speaks at length about this encounter with the Rebbe. And she says in her speech, "A rabbi who is an optimist taught me that what you think is a challenge is a gift from God." And she then added, "If poor babies have milk and poor children have food, it's because that rabbi in Crown Heights had vision." What was some of that vision? I'm accepting applause on the Rebbe's behalf. Okay. So, what was some of that vision? Part of it was an insistence that every act counts, which sounds rather obvious, but hadn't always been the case. I remember I was a teenager in the early 60s when John Glenn circled the globe, and John Kennedy, who was then president, announced that by the end of the decade, America will have a man on the moon. And he then quotes, regarding what John Glenn had just accomplished, the Chinese proverb, "A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step." The Rebbe understood that any one mitzvah could be the step that could lead people back into Jewish commitment. But the more I researched the book, and I spent 5 years working on the book, the more I realized the Rebbe's thinking was even more radical than that Chinese proverb. Because the underlying theme of that Chinese proverb is every step matters because it's part of the journey. The Rebbe believed that every step mattered in and of itself, even if it doesn't become part of the journey. Let me explain what I mean. He initiates a campaign of mitzvahim, a campaign of various mitzvot. Two of the famous ones were stopping men on the street and asking them if they're Jewish, and if they are, if they put on tefillin, do they want to put on tefillin? And in the case of women, do they light Shabbat candles? By the way, it's very interesting that he picked those two mitzvot, because let's say a couple started keeping them. You only put tefillin. Tefillin, for those of you who don't know what tefillin are phylacteries. Now you know. The truth is, the only thing you know is that if somebody uses the word phylacteries, they don't put them on. But the truth is, if a man starts putting on tefillin and a woman lights Shabbat, so tefillin are only worn on weekdays. And candles, obviously, are only lit on Shabbat and on holidays. So if a couple were to start, let's say, doing that, it would mean they'd be doing a Jewish activity every day. Now, understandably, when that campaign started to stop people in the street and encourage men to put on tefillin, many Jews who, or let's say less observant, and certainly Jews who are more secular, were quite uncomfortable with it. And this public display of Jewishness made them a little uneasy. What's less well known is that even within the Orthodox world, there was a lot of criticism directed at the Rebbe for this campaign. Some of the people from the Haredi world, which, ultra-Orthodox, they be called, the most traditionally observant, felt it was absurd. Why would you encourage someone to put on tefillin, and then after he or she, after he puts on tefillin, Chabad, he'll then go have an unkosher breakfast? Or why would you encourage a woman to light Shabbat candles, who'll then go out and violate the Shabbat in some other way? The Rebbe insisted, no, that's not the case. each mitzvah had a value in and of itself. If somebody put on tefillin and afterwards ate an unkosher meal, they had still put on tefillin. He appreciated every act that they did. In the case of the candle lighting, for many years, the New York Times every Friday would have a classified ad, Jewish women and girls. Because remember, in Jewish life, it was usually assumed a woman would start lighting candles either after she became bat mitzvah or after she was married. The Rebbe wanted children from the age of 3 to light candles. So every Friday, an ad would appear on the front page of the New York Times, a little classified ad, Jewish women and girls, candle lighting tonight is at 6:11 p.m., and encouraging people to light candles. Now I'll tell you a funny story, but it's really true. It's very accurate. On January 1st, 2000, the Times published its millennial edition, and they decided to add on as sort of an object of curiosity, imagining what the front page of the New York Times was going to look like on January 1st, 2100. The truth is, the front page was a little disconcerting. It seemed to be a very, very different world. There was a big article, should robots be allowed to vote in elections? Everything was guaranteed to make you feel you were living in a very strange world. Then in the middle of the page was a little classified ad, Jewish women and girls, candle lighting tonight. What had happened was that an editor at the Times, an Irish Catholic guy who was in charge of putting that page together, had realized that January 1st, 2100 was going to be on a Friday. And so he called up Chabad and he said, could they ascertain what time candle lighting would be on January 1st, 2100? I'm assuming the person who answered the phone said, if the Mashiach has not come at that point, candle lighting here will be at this and this time. That story symbolizes why Chabad was able to galvanize such broad-based affection and support from people who otherwise were not what you'd think of as traditionally observant Jews. Because many people, even if they weren't so observant, but who were very anxious to see Jewish life survive, might not have been so sure that their own descendants would be punctiliously lighting candles on January 1st, 2100, but they were sure Chabad would and would be encouraging other people to do so. So it really cut across all these lines in doing it. And again, as I said, it starts with that notion of a journey of 1,000 miles. One of the things I do in my book and was I try to ascertain an answer to a very significant question. In 1992, Rabbi Schneerson suffers a debilitating stroke. Subsequent to that stroke, he is never able to speak again. The doctors who were dealing with him differed to what extent he had full cognizance. Questions were still directed to him. He would nod, he would indicate yes or no. But his situation obviously was abnormal. He couldn't speak, and then he subsequently suffers another stroke and dies. During that period, from his first stroke, there was a lot of discussion in the Jewish world, what's going to happen to Chabad when the Rebbe dies? And the prevalent assumption was that the movement would probably start to decline. He was a charismatic leader. He had built up the movement, and yet he does die, and the movement has tripled in size in the number of its emissaries since that point. It's had a tremendous effect and a tremendous growth. And one of the phenomena I wanted to try and address in my book is, how does one explain it? And I argue, and I identify what I call 7 virtues of the Rebbe, 7 aspects of the Rebbe that I feel have served as a model for his emissaries, but they can serve for any people on how to conduct their lives. So let me share with you what some of them are. One of them was an insistence on a love of humanity and the particular love of every Jew. So you'll say, so what's the big chiddush? What's the big new insight? Hasn't the love your neighbor as yourself, it's a central law in the Torah. And the truth is, it is a central law in the Torah, and even beyond that. 2 of the greatest rabbinic figures of the Talmud, Hillel and Akiva, both insist that that is the central law in Judaism. Hillel says, the alecha sani, what's hateful unto you, don't do unto your neighbor. Kol Torah kula, this is the whole Torah, the rest is commentary. 100 years later, Rabbi Akiva says, "Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha zeh klal gadol b'Torah." Love your neighbor as yourself. This is a or the major principle of the Torah. The problem is, though, people quoted those rabbis, but it wasn't really observed. The Talmud itself says that the reason the Second Temple was destroyed was because of sinat chinam, causeless hatred in the Jewish community. The problem is we're all aware of the law of love your neighbor as yourself. It's probably one of the first teachings that we learned and heard as kids. But when we don't like somebody, we always are able to find an excuse why the law doesn't exactly apply to them. And this has been the bane and curse of Jewish life. A terrible tragedy happened. There were many tragedies in medieval Jewish history, but I'll cite one. In 1240, the Talmud is burned in France. 24 wagon loads of the Talmud are burned. The burning of the Talmud would obviously be a tragedy whenever it happened, but it was a much bigger tragedy in the 13th century when there were no printing presses. Every volume of the Talmud that was burned had been handwritten. And how did it come about? That makes the story even more tragic. The burning was conducted under the auspices of the French Inquisition. But what had happened was, 8 years earlier, 3 rabbis had gone to the French Inquisition, and they had denounced the writings of Maimonides to the Inquisition, including most significantly, the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide to the Perplexed. So these 3 rabbis bring the Moreh to the Inquisition to be burned. The Inquisition, the Dominicans, considered the Order of Dominicans, then starts looking into other Jewish writings. A Jewish apostate brings them passages from the Talmud. They end up burning the Talmud. At that point, one of the 3 rabbis, Yonah Gerundi, realizes what a terrible thing he had done. And he repents, and he writes a book, Sharei Tshuva, The Gates of Repentance, which to this day is still studied in the world of the yeshivot, because he came to understand what this hatred could bring about. So the Rebbe wanted to teach a non-judgmental love, a love that was not conditional. And he practiced it in many ways. It was in his essence. People who didn't really know him thought that it was just a technique, a strategy to get support from other Jews. No, he really felt it. When Rabbi Israel Meir Lau, who later became the chief rabbi of Israel, but at that time was a young rabbi, came to visit the Rebbe, and the Rebbe asked him what sort of work he was doing, and Lau said he was involved in kiruv rechokim. He was involved in bringing near those who are far away. And the Rebbe said to him, how do we know who's karov? How do we know who's near? How do we know who's far? They're all precious in God's eyes. I'm friendly with a man in New York who's a major philanthropic figure, George Rohr, who's a member of a modern Orthodox congregation on the east side of Manhattan, Kilas Yeshurun. George, in addition to being a very generous philanthropist, is himself a very knowledgeable Jew. And he was very proud to establish at Kilat Yeshurun an introductory minyan for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. There are Jews who are uncomfortable going to synagogue on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur because they don't really know the service. And so they feel stupid. We have this terrible problem in Jewish life because many, many Jews have high levels of secular education and much lower levels of Jewish education. And so the discrepancy between the two is very uncomfortable. People who are intellectually and have high levels of education are used to feeling very competent, and nobody likes to then suddenly put themselves in a situation of incompetence. So George started a minyan at KJ and was very proud to report to the Rebbe a few days later, I want the Rebbe to know that I had 180 people with no background at our Rosh Hashanah service. The Rebbe doesn't react to the news, and if anything, his face looks a little disapproving. So George, knowing that he said nothing controversial, assumes that the Rebbe, who then was already quite old, probably didn't hear him. So he did what we often do to older people. He started saying the same thing over in a louder voice. I want the Rebbe to know that, and that the 180 Jews with no background came to our Rosh Hashanah service. And the Rebbe looks at him and says, what do you mean they have no background? They're the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. He wanted to stop any feeling of superiority by those Jews who felt more knowledgeable. So he preached this love of the whole Jewish community. But he did something else as well. He always stayed focused on the individual. Very often when you deal with people who are dealing on macro issues, they have a real love and preach a love of humanity. But the trick is, can you always stay focused on every individual? To a remarkable extent, the Rebbe did so, and I know it from my own family, and in an event that probably helps explain how I came to write this book. My father was the accountant for the Rebbe for over 40 years. He was not only the accountant for the Rebbe, he was the accountant for the previous Rebbe as well. My father was the accountant for Chabad from the time it came to the United States, 1940. And in 1986, I was living in Israel, and my father suffered a bad stroke. My mother called me, and I flew back immediately from Israel, and my father, when I came back, was in a coma. He got out of the coma, but he was in a coma. And every day we'd get 2 calls from the Rebbe's office. The Rebbe wants to know how your father is. My father comes out of the coma, and his situation was not ideal. He was paralyzed on his left side and remained paralyzed. Thank God he was always able to speak. And his mind sometimes was clear, and sometimes it was less clear. Every day I continued to get a call from the Rebbe's office. Then a few days later, he's out of the stroke already, but he's still in ICU in intensive care. I get a call from Rabbi Krinsky, one of the Rebbe's top aides. A question came up today at a meeting of Merkaz. A question came up at a meeting today, and the Rebbe, an accounting question, the Rebbe said, ask Shlomo, my father. So I said, Rabbi Krinsky, you know how sick my father is? He said, of course we all know, but the Rebbe knows, but he had this question for your father. So at that point, of course, I went back to my father. I asked the question. My father looked at me a little surprised, and he said, well, the answer, you should do this and this. And of course, I reported that back. I was profoundly moved because I realized what had happened. The Rebbe was sitting at his office in Brooklyn, dealing with macro issues, major issues confronting the Jewish community, confronting his own movement. And he took the time to think about my father lying in a hospital bed, feeling very vulnerable, whose life had just collapsed. Until then, my father was still actively working. He was never able to practice his accounting again. He was not able again to give a weekly Talmud shiur as he used to do. And the Rebbe understood, in a sense, his vulnerability. And by asking him a question, he reminded my father there were still things he really could do. But it involved even more than that, because he had to come up with a question. He didn't want to come up with a question that was so simple that it would be condescending to ask my father, nor did he want to come up with a question that would be so, complex that my father wouldn't be able to answer it. So he had the moral imagination to try and do so. He remained focused on the individuals. There's a Chabad shliach in Baltimore now, Kaplan, is his first name Shmuel? And he told me a remarkable story that when he was a young rabbi, he had just been ordained, and he was studying at a kollel for, young married students. And he was told by Rabbi Chodakov at the Rebbe's instructions that there was a teenage girl who was in the midst of a real crisis of faith, and he should be a conduit for her. He should meet with her and try and resolve her issues and also be a conduit to the Rebbe. And the girl really was quite depressed and upset in the midst of a real, an extreme teenage rebellion. And one day, she gets a letter from the Rebbe in which the Rebbe says, I feel your pain. Instead of assuaging the girl, it actually antagonizes her. She starts saying to Rabbi Kaplan, what does it mean he feels my pain? How does he feel my pain? I know what I'm feeling. How does he know what I'm feeling? And Rabbi Kaplan immediately transmits her upset to the Rebbe, and within 2 hours gets an answer for the Rebbe. And to tell the young girl, she says to her, he says, in a few years your life will get better. Perhaps you'll fall, you'll fall in love, you'll marry, and you'll have a baby. And when you have a baby, it happens that towards the end of the first year of the baby's life, the baby starts teething. And teething is painful, and the baby will cry. And you as the mother will cry when you see your baby crying. Kach ani margish et tzarech. That's how I feel your pain. And Rabbi Kaplan told me that's what assuaged the girl. She felt that there was someone who understood her. This is an important lesson for all of us, because again, it's easy to love humanity and to do good things and to give to big, causes, but can you always stay focused on the individual? What were some of the other techniques the Rebbe used? Because these techniques not only ended up being proved useful to his emissaries, one of the things I discovered in writing the book was these characteristic virtues of the Rebbe are meaningful for every one of us, everybody in the Jewish community, and then I came to realize everybody in the whole world. The importance of non-judgmental love, we all need that. We need to give it and we want to receive it. The importance of staying focused on the individual. The creation of leadership. The Rebbe wanted to empower people. One of the first people I interviewed for the book was Label Groner, a very close aide to the Rebbe. And Rabbi Groner told me of an incident when he had come to the Rebbe with a halachic question, a question in Jewish law, and the Rebbe didn't answer him. The Rebbe said to him, "You have smicha, you have ordination like me. You go and check out the answer." Knowing the Rebbe probably didn't say check out the answer. He says, "You go and look it up." So Rabbi Groner did so, came back to the Rebbe, told the Rebbe what he had concluded, and the Rebbe smiled and said that was what he had concluded. He empowered Groner. I'll give you another example of that. I'm going to tell you the name of the rabbi because it's important to how this story concludes. Rabbi Moshe Yitzchak Hecht was the Chabad Shliach in New Haven, and in 74 he was going through a hard time. He had his own a bit of a spiritual crisis, certainly had a financial crisis. He was under an enormous amount of pressure, and he writes a letter to the Rebbe, and he says to the Rebbe, "I need you to help, and I need you to do it all." Instead of even expressing sympathy to Rabbi Moshe Yitzchak Hecht, the Rebbe writes him as follows: "I have already done as you have suggested. I have sent to New Haven Rabbi Moshe Yitzchak Hecht. It is apparent from your letters that you don't know this man. You don't know the strengths that were given to him. At least try to get him know him now, and everything will change immediately." He empowered people by sending them back to themselves. One of the most remarkable people who I had occasion to speak to was Tzvi Hirsch Weinrib. Weinrib was for many years the executive director of the OU, the Orthodox Union, the organization that's known by many people because it's the major certifier of products as kosher, the OU. And Weinrib today, who's retired from the OU, is the editor-in-chief of the English language translation of the whole Talmud based on the Steinsaltz commentary on the Talmud. So when he was 30 years old, we're talking about probably about 45 years ago, when he was 30 years old, he was a very accomplished young man. He already had a rabbinical ordination. He had just gotten his PhD at the University of Maryland in child psychology. He was working as a therapist. He was working in the public school system. He was married. He had kids. And as he put it, he had at the age of 30 a midlife crisis. He didn't know what direction he wanted his life to take. He was feeling a little overwhelmed. And a Chabadnik who knew him says, "Why don't you call and try and meet with the Rebbe?" So he calls up the Rebbe's office, and he finds out he's speaking on the phone to Rabbi Chodakov. And every time Chodakov asks him a question, he gives an answer, and Chodakov repeats it in a louder voice until he came to understand that the Rebbe apparently was in the room with Chodakov. So at a certain point, he hears the Rebbe call out from the back, "Who are you speaking to?" And Weinberg didn't particularly want to reveal his identity then yet. He didn't know if he was going to meet with the Rebbe. He said, "A Jew from Maryland." This was before the days of caller ID. So he just says, "A Jew from Maryland." Chodakov continues to ask him questions, and it's becoming more and more apparent what some of his issues are. And then he hears a voice in the background say, "Tell him that there's a Jew from Maryland named Weinrib that he should speak to." Weinrib, not Weinberg, Weinrib. So he yells out and he says, "That's me." So Chodakov is shocked and repeats that to the Rebbe. He says, "Azoi, if that's the case, tell him to consult with himself." He told me that this incident transformed his whole life. He said, "I was the sort of person who prior to this incident, whenever I had a problem, I would immediately call somebody to seek advice. I never trusted my own instincts. Ever since then, when an issue comes up in my life, Before I consult with anybody else, I sit down, he said, I read some teaching of the Rebbe, and I really ask myself, what do you want to see happen? And that's so important to many of us. Many of us instinctively don't trust our own instincts. We don't really think through. We have a situation, we have a problem, and we don't really think through what we'd like to see happen. So the Rebbe was very concerned with empowering people. Jonathan Sacks, who did later on become, the chief rabbi of England, when Sacks first met the Rebbe, he was 21. And he said, and he had no intention of becoming a rabbi. He was studying at Cambridge University. He wanted to go probably into law, economics, or philosophy. But he said the Rebbe influenced him to become a rabbi. But he remembers that day, he said to the Rebbe, in talking about his life, he said, recently I found myself in a situation. And the Rebbe interrupted him and said, don't use that expression. You placed yourself in a situation. And if you place yourself in one situation, then you can place yourself in another situation. The Rebbe didn't want people to be passive. He didn't want people to see themselves as victims of circumstances. He wanted people to take responsibility, because when you take responsibility, you start you start looking at other ways. You start seeing other possibilities and things that you can do. So it's very, very important. He was concerned with empowering people. And you know what? The first person you have to empower is yourself. And that's why he did that with Rabbi Hecht. And he did it with Rabbi Groner and with Tzvi Hirsch. Another thing the Rebbe was very concerned with, and this is applicable to all of us, he was very into the use of optimistic language. I'll give you an example of what I mean. I'm going to check out how many of you know some Hebrew. I'm going to ask you a word in Hebrew and just call it out. You don't have to raise your hand. Just call it out if you know it. How do you say hospital in Hebrew? Beit Cholim. There is no other word I know of in Israel in Hebrew for hospital. If you look up in any English Hebrew dictionary, Beit Cholim is the word for hospital. The Rebbe didn't like that word because those of you who know Hebrew know that what it literally means is house of the sick. And he thought that's a very negative thing to feel you're in the house of the sick. So he came up with a new word for hospital, Beit Refuah, house of healing. And he tried to get Israeli hospitals to change their name from Beit Cholim to Beit Refuah. And he told them it's not just a question of it being a nicer word, it sounds nicer. He said it's actually a more accurate word. You don't want people who come to your hospital to remain sick, you want them to be healed. So call it a Beit Refuah. When I first learned that, it reminded me of something my mother, Helen Telushkin, Aleh Shalom of blessed memory, had told me that when she was growing up in New York, they used to have hospitals called Home for the Incurables. Can you imagine telling somebody, we're transferring you to the Home for the Incurables? There were Jewish homes for the incurables. There were Catholic homes for the incurables. It was terrible. In the course of researching my book, I happened to have been reading a biography of Yossele Rosenblatt. Yossele Rosenblatt was probably the most famous chazan in American history. And Yossele Rosenblatt had given a free concert at the Montefiore Home for the Incurables. And what I saw in this biography was a letter of thanks he got from Jacob Schiff. Jacob Schiff was probably the most noted American Jewish philanthropist in the early 20th century. And Schiff was also the president of the Montefiore Home for the Incurables. So he writes Rosenblatt, the inmates want to thank you for your performance. I thought, my God, it's not enough that they're at the Home for the Incurables, they're referred to as inmates. The Rebbe was very into the usage, therefore, of optimistic language, because the words we feed ourselves very much influence how we're going to do. If we go into something with a great sense of pessimism, the very pessimistic words that we think about it are much more likely to guarantee that it's not going to work out. You don't want people walking around with such a, with a foolish, naive level of optimism that bears no relationship to reality. But in the normal order of events, there is a range of realistic emotions, ranging from the optimistic to the pessimistic. And the Rebbe was certain that only if you fed yourself with the optimistic words did you have a good chance at really succeeding. There's a term used in Hebrew, nechei tzahal. the handicapped of the Israeli army. And it's the term used for soldiers who suffered some permanent injury. In 1976, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, brought over on a tour to the United States a group of such soldiers, Nechei Tzahal. And one of the places they stopped off at was 770, where they met with the Rebbe. And the Rebbe, in speaking to them, made a very interesting observation. He says, you know, when somebody loses an important function, an important bodily function, there usually is some sort of compensatory mechanism. It's a known fact, and God should spare us, but people who are blind often develop better hearing, or they can understand things that they hear better than other people can. He said, by calling you Nechei Tzahal, you're being defined only by what you lack. But you have capabilities that you've developed that the rest of us don't have, which makes you exceptional. Why don't they call you Mitsuyanei Tzahal, the exceptional ones? That reminded me of something I had read years earlier, of an American Army veteran who had lost his arms during World War II. And he remembered that as they prepared to release him from the Army hospital, a doctor practicing a version of what's called tough love, you know, he wanted to prepare people for the outside world. So he said to all these very badly wounded veterans, he said, this year you're war veteran heroes. Next year you're simply war veterans. By year 3 you'll all be just cripples. That's the tough love he wanted to practice, as opposed to Mitsuyanei Tzahal. I'll give you an example of something I learned while working on this book that changed the way I speak. The Rebbe didn't like the word deadline. Now, I'm a writer, and you can be sure that when you're a writer, the word deadline is a very real part of your word. But he said it triggers very negative connotations. So I started using now due date. Think of the difference between deadline and due date. Deadline connotes death. Due date denotes birth. So this is what he was trying to do. A man once came to visit with the Rebbe, and he was bemoaning the particular fact that he had raised his son to be a committed Jew, and now his son wasn't a committed Jew, and he's sort of going on, kvetching a bit. And then he sort of said, you know what they say, it's schwer zu sein a Yid, it's hard to be a Jew. How many of you have ever heard that expression? It's a common known expression. The Rebbe said, I'm just curious, is that an expression you use often? The man said, well, it is hard to be a Jew. And I have said it often. And the Rebbe then said, well, why are you then so surprised that your son isn't so interested in being a Jew? It's not a smart way to raise people. He said, why don't you try using the expression, es ist gut zu sein a Yid? It's good to be a Jew. Because words are so critically important. We know it when anybody points it out to us, and then we have a tendency to forget it. And he was very insistent on not forgetting that and continuing to do that. I learned an important piece of advice on my own work schedule. The Rebbe used to use an expression called hatzlacha bizman, having success with time. And he rooted it in an event from his own life. In 1927, he was engaged to the daughter of the previous Rebbe, the sixth Rebbe. The sixth Rebbe, known today as the previous Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe, Yosef Yitzchak, was then in Russia. And it was terrible. In 1927, Russia was under full communist rule. The regime was anti-religion, to say the least, and it was particularly anti-Judaism. The sixth Rebbe was subsequently arrested. It looked for a while like he was actually going to be executed. He was then exiled. But it was a terrible period. And he was about to take a trip from St. Petersburg, which was then called Leningrad, to Moscow. And everybody knew that he was going to be shadowed the entire time by the Soviet secret police. So Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who was then, his future son-in-law, like everybody else in the house, was very nervous. But he enters the room where his father-in-law is, and he sees his father-in-law calmly working at his desk, answering letters, answering papers, answering letters that had been written to him. And, wait, give me 1 second, because I want to get this accurately, what I'm going to say. And he asks his father-in-law, how can you work there so calmly? In an hour, you're setting out for the train station. You're going to be trailed. And he really was arrested sometime later. And his father-in-law said his philosophy of how to use time, which he had learned from his own father. The first thing he said to him that you have to grasp is, number one, you can never add to the amount of time in the day or the night. Time is finite. The only way you can carry out everything you need to do is to utilize whatever time you have to its full capacity. And the only way you can do it to its full capacity is to give your entire concentration to what you are doing at that moment. Therefore, when you are working on one task, quote, we must regard anything else we have done before and anything that we are planning to do later as totally insignificant. Is this easy to do? No. It is very hard to do, which is why I'd suggest try doing it for 5 minutes and then for 10 minutes. Work on something and don't allow any other thoughts to intrude. If you had a fight that morning with your wife or husband or with your children, or if you have some concern on health or on any issue, and I'm talking, I'm not raising trivial issues, I'm raising serious issues, try during those 5 or 10 minutes to mentally block those thoughts whenever they start intruding. If you're nervous about an appointment you're having later in the day, try and block it from intruding. Is it appropriate to focus on those things? Yes, but when you focus on them, only focus on them. Don't focus on other things. Meantime, focus on what's in front of you. And that way you'll be able to achieve things. What I found over and over when I spoke to people who had spent time with the Rebbe is that they would say they felt that when they were with him, he was fully conscious of them. He was fully focused on them. Often we meet people and we feel that their minds are drifting. Often in my own work, I know I'm not working as creatively as I can because I'm letting thoughts either from earlier in the day or concerns about something later in the day intrude. To have atzlacha bizman, success with time, focus on what's in front of you. I'll give you another interesting technique of the Rebbe, what I call how to disagree without being disagreeable. That's a very hard thing to do. Every 4 years when there are presidential elections going on, and I'm speaking before audiences, and particularly if I know that there are people with either strongly liberal or strongly conservative, given the nature of the Jewish community, most Jews who are passionately political are usually liberals. And there's a small minority who are, not small, but there's a minority who are conservatives. And I'll always ask people, can you think of a single reason somebody's voting for the candidate you oppose that doesn't reflect badly either on the person's intellect or character? And I rarely find liberals or conservatives who can think of a single reason why somebody's voting for the other party's candidate other than the fact that either they're a little deficient in their intellect or they're selfish. The Rebbe, that's exactly what he wanted to avoid. People, therefore, look for excuses to dismiss other people. A rabbi writes the Rebbe a letter about a sharp disagreement he has with the Rebbe, and the Rebbe writes back, acknowledges the disagreement. Believe me, the Rebbe had passionate views on many issues. He didn't feel he had to backtrack. But he then says to the rabbi, but there are 612 areas on which we agree. Referring, of course, metaphorically to the 613 mitzvot in the Torah. And he found a way that he could disagree with others without identifying the other person with that position. How does he do it? One of the ways he did it is, I spoke to Rabbi Michal Seligson. Rabbi Seligson worked for 20 years and produced a 1,600-page index to all of the Rebbe's public speeches. And he said one of the techniques of the Rebbe was he would never criticize somebody by name. The Rebbe used to say, I speak about shitot, I don't speak about people. I speak about approaches, I don't speak about individuals. The Rebbe had profound disagreements with Jimmy Carter. But when Carter finished his term as president, the Rebbe, and he started to be very severely criticized, the Rebbe said, there were good things that he did. And he said, I'm in no way backtracking on what I disagreed in what he did. But there has to be an appreciation for the good that another person has done. You can't just take one issue that you know about somebody and then dismiss the entire person. And the result is that's how you can disagree with someone without becoming disagreeable. I'll give you one other example that the Rebbe told me. It was very profoundly moving to me. One of the people who I'm quite friendly with in New York is Ruth Messenger. Just out of curiosity, how many of you are familiar with who Ruth is? Okay, a lot of you. Ruth Messenger was the borough president of Manhattan, and she ran against Rudolph Giuliani for mayor, and she lost. And a few years later, she's since then had what I've told her is, I think, the greatest second act two of anybody I know. She became the head of the American Jewish World Service, an organization committed. Wait, I haven't even looked at my clock. Okay, I only have another 45 minutes. No, I don't. Okay. I have 5 more minutes. Okay. I'm not telling you this story. No, okay, I'll tell you this story quickly. So Ruth, now I forgot what I was going to say. Oh, so Ruth became the head of American Jewish World Service, which is really committed to Tikkun Olam. It does an enormous amount of work helping improve the lives, overwhelmingly of non-Jews, but by Jews who were doing it on the basis of Jewish teaching. So it's really carrying a Jewish message into a broader world. And she was one of the people to whom I gave the book, and she gave me a blurb on the back of the book, and she said, I want you to know the book has already started to change my own behavior. And it was another one of the teachings of the Rebbe that so affected her. We were all raised with the expression, anything worth doing is worth doing. The Rebbe's attitude was, anything worth doing is worth doing now. A rabbi named Shapsi Katz from Pretoria, South Africa, meets with the Rebbe in December of '78. In addition to having a small pulpit in Pretoria, he also was the prison chaplain for Jewish prisoners. Most of the Jews who were in prison then were political prisoners. He meets with the Rebbe. The Rebbe says, which holidays does the government in South Africa recognize? So he says only 3, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Pesach. So the Rebbe says, what about Hanukkah? He says, no. The Rebbe says, you know how important it is for somebody in prison to be able to light a Hanukkah candle? Do you know in the darkness of prison how important it is to have a light? And so Katz is so moved by what the Rebbe says that he promises that next year he's going to do everything in his power to get Jews the right to light Hanukkah candles in prison. The Rebbe says, what about this year? Katz says, what can I do? It's Hanukkah in 2 days. I'm here in the United States. The Rebbe says, do you have the phone number of the head of the prisons, of the head chaplain of all the prisons? Turns out Katz did have the number. The Rebbe said, call him. He's uncomfortable doing it. The Rebbe says, not only that, call him right now. He says, I can't call him right now. Why not? It's the middle of the night in South Africa. It's 4 in the morning. The Rebbe says, noch besser, even better. He'll realize that it's a very important matter. Katz does it, and the guy agrees, and he immediately sends out orders the following morning that Jewish prisoners be allowed to light candles. We all know that there are things we should do, and we say tomorrow, in 2 days, we keep delaying them. If it's worth doing it now. So I'll just leave you with one final thought. Ultimately, the significance of the Rebbe is not just to Chabad. The significance of the Rebbe is to everybody who has lessons that can be learned from this very, very smart man. So one of them is have a little more non-judgmental love in our lives. Don't look for reasons to exclude people. Don't take a position that somebody has as the reason to then not take them seriously. Don't think, oh, that reflects on his character, his intelligence. Think, you know what? It's important. It's an important day in your life when you meet somebody of a different religion or of a different political view who's both good and intelligent. And you have to think, my friend Dennis Prager once made that comment to me, and he certainly has strong political views. So the question is, can you practice a non-judgmental love? You can think of your areas of commonality with that person. Can you always try and make sure to stay focused on the individual? Can you develop a fearlessness in yourself, which starts with an understanding that the first person to consult with is yourself? And thereby, if you want to empower others, first learn how to empower yourself. Can you learn how to disagree without being disagreeable? How do you have success with time? By focusing on that which is right in front of you and not allowing yourself to be dissuaded and to be unfocused because you get caught up in things from the past or from the future, and remembering that anything worth doing is worth doing now. We're getting ready for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Any one of these teachings has the ability to elevate your life. A few of them can transform us all for the better. Thank you very much.
Okay, I know you all have questions for the rabbi. So Becky and I have microphones down here. I've learned so much, I think my head's going to burst, and I can't wait to start changing. So here we go. Here's the first question.
A voice from the past. Karen Rosenfeld wrote card.
Oh. My friend who graduated high school with me at the Yeshiva of Flatbush, and I will spare us both by saying what year we graduated. It was about 8 years ago. Okay, yes.
So I've become part of the Jewish Renewal Movement, and one of the people who founded Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi Zal. The question I have relates to him because I know I've heard that it was considered that he would be the Rebbe's successor. I don't know if that's a rumor, or where did he fit in with the whole Chabad
Okay,
scene?
Reb Zalman Schachter, who was a dear friend of mine, who I spent many, many hours on this book, was never up for consideration as being a successor, though he had a genuine relationship. He first met the Rebbe in Marseille when they were both fleeing the Nazis, and he had a close relationship with the Rebbe. Zalman, over certain issues, moved away. You know, Zalman was very close with Shlomo Carlebach, and they both ended up not within the world of Chabad, but Zalman always stayed very attached to it, to the day of his death, and we lost Reb Zalman in early July. He would study Tanya every morning, and Zalman left instructions that upon his death he wanted the Tahara, the purification of the body, done by the Chabad rabbi in Boulder, where Zalman is. So Zalman was an enormous source of information for me, and at the end of his life he sort of fused his commitments to Jewish renewal and to Chabad together, and he always considered himself very much within that world. And Zalman had some very interesting stories that he told me. One story that he told me, about a month after the death of the previous Rebbe in 1950, Zalman came into New York. Then he was a full-fledged part of the world of Chabad, and he went to the grave, the Ohel of the previous Rebbe, and then he came to 770, the headquarters of Chabad, and as he's getting in, he's washing his hands, which you do when you're coming from a cemetery. And so Menachem Mendel Schneerson saw him doing so. Remember, he was Menachem Mendel Schneerson then, he was not yet the Rebbe, and he said to Zalman, understanding that he was coming from the Rebbe's grave, he said, I bless you that whatever you prayed for should come to pass. So Zalman answered enigmatically, if they only let it. So the Rebbe then said to him, what did you pray for? He said, I prayed that we should have a Rebbe, I prayed that you should be the Rebbe, and I prayed that you should have children. Now, in the course of 5 years of working on the book, there were only 3 instances I ever came across where anybody ever made reference to the Rebbe's childlessness to him directly. And the Rebbe didn't engage the issue, though Zalman said his eyes welled up in tears. And he said to Zalman, why do we need a new Rebbe? We have already. Why does it matter whether he's there, meaning in the grave, or he's here? And Zalman then answered him, why does it say at the end of the Torah that we don't know where Moshe was buried? We don't know where Moses was buried. He said, that's so that Joshua couldn't send people to pray at Moses' grave. In other words, we need a living Rebbe. And I said to him, that's an inspired answer. And I have also a note about something else Zalman told me, which Zalman had a proclivity for New Age things. You know, Zalman was experimenting with drugs, with LSD. He was a dear friend of Timothy Leary. But he obviously had this tendency from a very early age. So one of the things he told me was that he said to the Rebbe during that year of transition, he said to the Rebbe, should I study techniques of channeling? of communicating with the dead so that I can bring you messages from your father-in-law who had, just died. So I said to Zalman, first of all, isn't that totally forbidden by Jewish law? Because the Torah actually prohibits trying to contact the dead. And he said no, because of the Talmudic maxim, tzadikim afilu b'mitatan, tzadikim, even when they're dead, are considered to be alive. Trying to communicate with the soul of a tzaddik isn't wrong. So I said, so what did the Rebbe say to you? So he said, the Rebbe said to me, my Yiddish is terrible, so I'm not going to be able to say it. In my book, I actually transliterate it into the Yiddish. But he said, the Rebbe said to him, if my father-in-law wants to find ways to communicate with me, he will do so even without dancing tables. Because any of you who've ever been to a movie know that whenever they depict a seance, tables start moving up and down. So, but that was a very, very important element, this part of Zalman's life. Thank you. Thank you, Karen. Come over and say hello afterwards. One of the nice things about this book, I've been meeting people from my past. Yes.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Hi. I came all the way from Seattle, Washington, D.C.
Okay.
Yeah. So I wanted to know what made you decide to write a book about the Rebbe.
Why did I want to write a book about the Rebbe? The Rebbe now was recently the 20th anniversary since his death. At the time of his 12th anniversary, I had written an article about him for the newspaper, The Forward, in which I told the story of what had happened with my father. And I wrote certain other things, and I sort of realized at the time that we're dealing with a figure, a transformative figure. Normally when a charismatic leader dies, and this is what I started speaking of earlier, a movement at best stays what it is or starts to decline. The Rebbe's influence has been growing. There have been a number of very great rabbinic figures, both within the Orthodox and the non-Orthodox world. In the first half of the 20th century, probably the most famous rabbi in the United States was Stephen S. Wise. He was a very major figure. He was a pro-Zionist figure. He had a whole relationship with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Today, there's a famous synagogue named for him both in New York and in L.A., but I don't think that many people are familiar with him. The odd thing about the Rebbe is that he's very well known in the United States, in Israel, in France, and the former Soviet Union, which are the four most populous Jewish countries today. So I realized we're suddenly dealing with a person whose influence is great and is growing, and we need models of it. The Jewish community today we haven't been growing by leaps and bounds in numbers. We've been losing a lot of people. And here's a man who obviously developed some techniques that have been very effective. And I thought that would be a good place to study. People said, did you enter the book with a high regard for the Rebbe? I said, yeah, I did. Who would want to spend 5 years of their life studying the life of somebody you had a low regard for, or you didn't have or you were very neutral about? So that's how it came about. I hadn't done it. Now, it was hard for me. It's the longest I've worked on any book, because I've written quite a number of books. I had never before done a biography quite of this. I had written a biographical work on Hillel, but that's a little different because everything you need to know about Hillel is in the Talmud. There is literally no reference to Hillel outside of the Talmud and Midrash. The Rebbe was tricky to do, hard to do, because he was very unself-revealing. The Rebbe did not normally speak. He was not one of those anecdotal raconteurs. So I had to learn from his interactions with others of what it was. But my wife used to say, what the good thing is? Whenever you come home from 770 Eastern Parkway, the headquarters of the movement in Brooklyn, she says you're in a good mood because Chabadniks tend to be a rather optimistic lot. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Got a question?
Can you please speak to us about the Rebbe's advice around Sholem Bayis for married couples, for husbands and wives who ask for advice, and/or for people who are wanting to get married?
For people who want to get married, I don't, I feel stupid. I don't have any particular advice, though ironically, it's just by odd, strange coincidence, I had spoken earlier today in Palo Alto, and the person who introduced me, we were speaking beforehand, and I said, what sort of work you were doing? It turned out his previous job, he had been the CEO for eHarmony.com. And he said during the time he was CEO, they had an average of 542 marriages a day from people who had met. So, look, what the Rebbe's advice, I'm sure, would have been, but here I have to be careful because I'm not thinking of it. I didn't write on this in the book, and you know what? Rather than misrepresent what the Rebbe said, there were 3 volumes that have appeared in which they culled from all the Rebbe's writings. And if you look it up, I know that there are some Chabad shluchim here. Do any of you know the book I'm referring to? There are 3 volumes of dealing with it. Menachem, Mendel, Schneerson, in his advice on marriage issues. It's all culled from the 30-volume... Eternal Joy. Okay, so Eternal Joy, and that's it. And you know what? I realize I don't have any really good thing. No, and I don't want to misrepresent, or I don't want to say something simplistic.
Any more
I'm
questions?
sorry.
Well, yeah, are you coming with a question, sir? Great. In the meantime, Rabbi, give us one more story about the Rebbe that you, in the 45 minutes that I didn't let you speak. Have you got another one you can share with us?
I have a great story.
Great.
And after I answer this question, I'll
Okay,
give it, because
that's great.
I'm going to then end my speech with that story.
That's perfect. Okay, go ahead.
Did the Rebbe advocate something parallel to what Yisro pleaded Moshe Rabbeinu to do? I mean, the administration of justice, if there are disagreements in a Chabad house, did he feel that the head of each Chabad house had absolute power? Did he advocate a type of justice that would genuinely deal with people with grievances within a Chabad house?
This is probably, it's an interesting question, which I didn't exactly, come across in that he had a worked out system. He obviously had a very reverential attitude towards Yisro, because Yisro is the one who ultimately, Jethro is the one who advocates to Moshe to establish the whole system of justice. I don't think he took the attitude necessarily that the leader of the Chabad house had any absolute power, because that was not, the Rebbe didn't, normally think in those terms. I don't know of any systematic, I'm not sure what you're getting at, of any systematic mechanism by which he could do it. It was like any religious movement, so I'm not sure. Sounds like you might be thinking of some specific situation.
These things come up. I remember reading something by a mental health professional who felt a person who was active in the Chabad movement, he was deprived of a leadership role, and this mental health professional felt that this man with a young wife and children suffered needlessly.
You know what, it's too, I suppose every case has to be cited on the basis of that, and I obviously don't know enough to comment on it. So let me then conclude then with one remarkable story. If you can come, you'll maybe ask me afterwards.
Absolutely,
then, if you want.
absolutely.
Okay, this is a story I heard from Avraham Berkowitz. Avraham Berkowitz is a Chabadnik, a man probably in his late 30s or approximately now, who's been very much involved also in bringing teachings of the Rebbe to a broader world, not just the Jewish world. But he told me of an incident that happened in his own life when he was about 20. He was not yet ordained, he was not yet married, and he and a friend used to go every summer to Alaska. Alaska then already had a Chabad representative in Anchorage, and they would go to the outlying parts of Alaska. Chabadniks, as a rule, are not super shy. If you're sent out from the age of 15 to a street and stop people and ask them, are you Jewish? Did you put on tefillin? If you're very shy, you get weeded out in the process. So anyway, he and his friend found a pilot who worked for one of the Alaskan airlines that did domestic flights, who was an Israeli by background, and probably illegally arranged that whenever he knew there would be at least 2 empty chairs on a plane, would tell them they could come along, and they would go to a city and they'd try and find Jews. The plane would stay there for a few hours. And so he takes them to a city in northwest Alaska. There's a reason I'm not telling you the name of the city. I'll explain that reason later. And it's a city overwhelmingly comprised of Native Americans, which in Alaska means Eskimos. So they get off the plane, and Avraham and his friend find the mayor of the town, and they ask him if there are any Jews in the town. And he says, no, I've never met any Jews here. But he recognizes that these guys are religious Jews. He says, the public school kids here will never meet a Jew in their lives. And he arranges for them to go speak at the local public school. So they go to the local public school, and he's a very personable guy. So some of the kids show off an Eskimo dance for him. He and his friend do a Chabad dance, a Hasidic dance. But then before he leaves, he asks, have any of you ever met a Jew? And a girl raises her hand and says, I know a Jew. And he says, who? She says, my mother. And her mother is standing there. Her mother's a 5th grade teacher at the school. So the session ends, and he goes over with the girl, speaks to the mother, and it turns out she came from what she calls the lower 48 and had gone up to Alaska. She was proud of her Jewishness, but it wasn't, she was proud of her Jewishness, but she wasn't so committed. She fell in love and married a man, an Eskimo man there, and then she says to Berkowitz, you're probably the only Jew, certainly the only rabbi my daughter will ever meet in her lifetime. Tell her something that can leave her with a sense of pride in her Jewishness. So think about it for a moment. What would you tell the girl? Anyway, so he says to her, he tells her a little about Shabbat. For 24 hours, 25 hours, Jews leave the world alone. We don't try and manipulate the world. We let the world influence us. And he says, but who inaugurates the Shabbat every week? He says it's Jewish women. They light candles. And it starts first in the Far East. He asks the girl, so where are the first candles lit? So the girl's mother taught geography at the school, so she said probably in Australia or New Zealand, and he says, you're right. And then it spreads across Asia, and then it spreads across Europe, and then it comes to the United States, to New York, to Chicago, to Seattle, to Anchorage. And the whole Jewish world is waiting and looking to have the candles lit. And then it comes to the Northwest territory where you are. You might well be the last person lighting candles, and the whole Jewish world is waiting for you. So I said to him, that was an inspired answer. How did you come up with that? And he said, because of what had happened to me. He said, I only met the Rebbe once in my life. He said, I grew up in Detroit. My parents were Balei Tshuva. They were Jews who had become religiously observant in their adult years. And before my bar mitzvah, they sent me to Crown Heights to spend a few days there. All the other kids in Crown Heights had family members there. I didn't know anybody. The only one I recognized was the Rebbe. I go to the synagogue, and it's the 7th day of Passover. And in the latter part of the service, the priests, Jews of priestly background, the Kohanim, they bless the congregation. They duchen for the congregation. And he said, I knew we were Kohanim. Because at our shul in Detroit, I used to go up with my father, and I'd be under my father's tallis, and we would bless the congregation. So I run up to the front of the shul with all the other Kohanim. He said, I didn't realize that because there were so many people at that service, it got too crowded at the front, so only the elderly Kohanim were invited to go up. So here I am, I'm this young kid with all these older Kohanim, and also, unmarried men there don't wear a tallis. So they all had talisim on, and he was a kid. He was used to being under his father's tallis. He didn't have a tallis on. So all these other people are looking at him with some annoyance, and they're motioning for him to put on a tallis. He doesn't know what to do. He looks down to the front of the synagogue, and he sees the Rebbe. And the Rebbe understands what's going on and starts to remove his own tallis to give it to the boy. When other Hasidim see the Rebbe removing his tallis, they run and give him a tallis. The Rebbe was known that he would never speak during the service, but when he came down, the Rebbe would congratulate the Kohanim, and he said to Avram Berkowitz, with the other Kohanim, he said 3 times, Yashakayach Kohen, Yashakayach Kohen, Yashakayach Kohen, which in effect means congratulations. It literally means your strength should be strengthened, but in effect it means congratulations. He said, the Rebbe personalized that mitzvah for me. And I knew at that moment I had to personalize this mitzvah for that girl. We all need to adopt a mitzvah. We all need to personalize one mitzvah. There are a lot of mitzvahs to do, but that's what the Rebbe was able to do for him. Oh, by the way, and the reason I didn't tell you the name of the city, because he said to me, Berkowitz, if you say the name of the city and you say the name of the girl, every Friday Chabadniks are going to start calling her up. Did you light candles this week? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We'll see you outside with a little nosh, and Rabbi Telushkin will be out there to autograph some books.